if you say what you want to say and let the words fall out. Honestly, I want to see you be brave with what you want to say and let the words fall out. Honestly, I want to see you be brave.
Well, it's already been a great morning. We're glad you're here. I want to thank you for showing up. They did take that money out. She didn't tell you, but those children have raised $200. That's what was in that jar. That's pretty awesome. Yeah, I think they deserve some applause for that. Couple of things I want to hit before we get into our message today. There is a sign up in the back for the men's retreat. Men, if you haven't signed up for that, that's September 9th and 10th. Also, you need to sign up today for the ladies' retreat. That is also happening September 23rd and 24th. So if you didn't pick up one of these, you may think you don't need the order of worship because we don't hardly follow it anyway. But you might want to go ahead and get one because there's some good information in here. So you need to track that down. Also, Hilltoppers is today. That is our senior saints. They are going to have a meal over here. Now, I'll just tell you, they don't check your AARP card when you go in there. So you can go in. If you're visiting with us today and you won't eat, they won't kick you out, I promise. So keep that in mind. It's usually excellent. Now, Bob and Jeanette aren't in here, so they're going to be real mad at me for inviting more people to their meal, but that's okay. Speaking of which, we do want to remind you, Bob's mom goes to a specialist on Wednesday, and so as you're praying, be sure and pray for that as well. This morning we're continuing our Brave series. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 5. We're going to read from Mark chapter 5. We're going to skip a section in the middle. As we're reading about Jairus, we're going to skip the section with the woman with the issue of blood because we want to just focus on the parents this morning. I'm not trying to rewrite the Bible. I'm just trying to stick to one story at a time. So stay with me. We'll jump in about the middle. Starting in verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. We're going to skip down to verse 34. After he heals her, he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? That child's not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. And he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. There's a man walking through the supermarket pushing a cart with a couple of items in it, and attached to him is a baby, and this baby is screaming. I mean, if you've been in the supermarket and heard the screaming baby, this baby is screaming. And as he's walking, the man is pushing his cart and he's whispering, he's murmuring, "Calm down, George. It's going to be okay, George. George, don't scream. George, it's going to be all right. Calm down. It's going to be okay." And a lady that he passes by says, You just should be admired for the way you try to comfort little George." And he goes, "Lady, I'm George." Parenting is hard, right? Anybody who's been one for a while, even for the little infants, you realize parenting is hard. It's not easy. Parenting will leave you in a place where you are helpless and distressed and sometimes even outside of your mind. When Allie was 3, she and I were playing a game and I would turn and jump at her and she'd run off giggling, and we did this up and down the hall, and she turned to run down the hallway and smacked her head face first right into the corner of a wall. And so there's a big gash and blood seeping down. And, you know, I have pictures of me skinning animals and being knee-deep in stuff and not being scared of anything. But my child's blood made me lose my mind. And I pick her up and I'm like, and Hillary's like, okay, you're going to have to get her in the car and take her to the hospital. And I'm like, you're not going? And she says, Jeff, we have a baby. And I'm like, a baby? What? Just outside of your mind. We just lose our mind. When I was, parenting will also reveal things to you about yourself that you never knew existed, right? When I was teaching in the SDC class, which is Teacher Speak or Education East, whatever you want to call it. It was an acronym for the behavior class. We had the severe special ed, severe behavior disorder children that nobody else wanted. And my guys were the ones who would attack people and who would try to hurt people and stab you and whatnot. It was a pleasant classroom. You see why I was uniquely equipped for church work, right? Anyway, as I was teaching, we had on Conroe High School campus a child care lab, and in that lab, the kids got to come and the teenagers got to come and learn how to do child care, and they would receive a certification that they could use when they got out in the real world. And it was a good perk for us as teachers because we got cheap child care, and we could bring our children and they could stay there. Well, during one of our incidents, when I was dealing with a particularly violent and disturbed individual, he told me that he knew which one of those children over there was mine. And then he proceeded to go into vicious detail about what he planned to go over there and do to her. Now, whenever I had a problem like that, I immediately had the police and the administrators coming. And when they got there, I was walking down the hall. I left the classroom and I was walking down the hall. I met my principal coming the other way, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm on a child safety walk." And he says, "What's that?" And I said, "That's when I leave the room for the safety of the child." Because I had never in my mind seriously thought about hurting someone. But in that moment, all that parent stuff that Allie's my first kid. I had never experienced any of that before. You know, and some of you parents are nodding right now because you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you've never experienced it before, you experience this thing that comes up in you and Mama Bear or Papa Bear comes out and you didn't know they existed. And it's scary because it puts you in a place where there is almost nothing you would do or would not do to protect your child. And this morning, in this passage in Mark, that's where Jairus finds himself. Jairus is in a place where his daughter is sick. And we're not talking tummy ache. This is the real deal, and he knows it. He knows that she's not going to make it unless he does something desperate. And so he goes looking for Jesus. He's in a place of desperation. He's in a place of helplessness. And I think many of us can sympathize with that, if not now as a parent, at some point. Because parenting is hard. And at some point, we will be in a position of desperation and helplessness. At some point, we're going to be in a place where we are calling out to God, what do I do now? Because we don't have a owner's manual. We don't have as many books as you want to try to buy. There's not a manual for how to raise every child. And so we find ourselves in a place of desperation and helplessness just like Jairus. And this morning, I think there are 4 things that Jairus had to be brave enough to face on his road to healing as he is reaching out in this place of desperation. And I want us to look at those briefly this morning because I think there's something that can equip all parents through this journey of parenthood. First of all, Jairus had to be brave enough to face his own pride. Jairus is a synagogue ruler. He is a leader in the church of that time, in the Jewish church, in the synagogue. He is above everybody else. He is connected with the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day. It is also an elected position. Now imagine any of our elected officials today who would debase themselves, who would bow down. We have a hard time picturing that. Jairus is in that spot where he's got to do something. And he has been part of that religious establishment who came out and spoke out against Jesus. We don't have any record that Jairus himself was doing it, but in Luke there are passages where synagogue leaders chastised Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. We know that the religious establishment spoke out against Jesus, and as a synagogue ruler, he would have been part of that, whether he agreed with it or not. And so for him to come out publicly before Jesus and say, I want you to come to my home and lay your hands on my child, was a huge shot to his pride. And we see that today because a lot of us as parents, we're proud, and we're in a position, maybe we're in a place where we feel like church is a place and we have to keep this face on, right? You know what I'm talking about. You got to look your Sunday best. And for some of us, that doesn't stop with clothing. That has to do with putting on a false front that we have it all together. When in reality, we know that inside, we are far from having it all together. But we're too proud to admit that. We're too proud to stand up and say, I need help, I need prayer, I need Jesus to come into my home, like Jairus. That's hard. But Jairus didn't just have to face his pride. He also had to be brave enough to face his religiosity. That's not a word, I made that up. But his religion, his religiousness, his tie to that Jewish religion that said that Jesus was an upstart Messiah. He was an upstart rabbi who had no training, he had no sanction, he had no school of thought that he was a part of. He was not supposed to be somebody that we were kneeling in front of because he was not one of the establishment. This guy was outside the lines. He didn't support the Sabbath. He spoke out against the temple. He cursed the religious leaders and called them broods of vipers and everything else. And these guys did not want to validate his teaching because he was outside of their religiosity. Sometimes we find ourselves in the same place today because our religion, our traditions keep us so locked in that we can't come before Jesus. We can't let ourselves go because it wouldn't be decent and in order. We can't come and kneel down before Jesus and say, my child, my family, I need you to come into my home because I can't do this by myself. And so we find ourselves bumping up against pride, but also bumping up against our religion. Because sometimes our religion is what's keeping us from Jesus. And that's not right. Sometimes our religion is what's costing us generations of young people. Because we have students and young adults who are saying, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to reach a new generation. And we say, no, you conform to our traditions or else. And generations are choosing else. Sometimes our religion is what's keeping us from Jesus. And Jairus has to be brave enough to stand against that religion. And when you do that, you have to be brave enough to face the judgment of others. Because that's the third thing that Jairus has to face. He has to be brave enough to face the judgment of others. When they get to his house, before they even get to his house, when Jesus is still healing the woman with the issue of blood, the guys from his house show up and say, hey, she's dead, let it go. Don't bother Jesus anymore. It's over. It's hopeless. Some of you in this room have been told that about your children. It's over. It's hopeless. Let them go. You know how I know that? Because I was one of those kids. I was one who my parents were told, I'm not kidding you, a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ said, he should just be dead to you. And you know what? Praise God that my mom and dad were too stubborn, that's where I get it, to listen. Because they didn't. And there are a lot of you today who are being told it's helpless. It's hopeless. You need to just let them go. You need to turn them over to whatever it is that they're into and move on. And I'm telling you what Jesus tells Jairus in that moment. Don't be afraid. Just believe. In that moment, when those people are telling Jairus, hey, let it go, walk away, it's too late. There's nothing he can do. Jesus stops what he's doing, turns to him, and in that instant says, don't be afraid. Just believe. That's what parents need to hear today. Whether your child is one of those that you've been told should be abandoned, or whether your child is a little infant in your arms, you need to hear Jesus say, don't be afraid, just believe. When they get to the house, Jesus says, she's not dead, but she's asleep. And the mourners laugh at him. Right? You read that? You know, the mourners were like a professional group. They came in whenever somebody died, and your status in the community was determined by how many mourners you had. So the more mourners, the louder the mourners, the higher your rank was. And so there's a lot of mourners in here because Jairus was an important individual. And Jesus comes in and says, she's not dead, but she's just asleep. And they laugh at him because death is their business. They're professionals. They know what this looks like. And they know that she's not sleeping. And they laugh at him. And Mark says Jesus put them out. It's interesting to know that the Greek there that is used for put them out is the exact same phrase that is used when Jesus clears the money changers out of the temple. I don't think he thought anything about it was funny. He kicked them out, is what he did. He put them out. He put them out physically. He let them know, get out of here. God is in this house and things are about to change. There are times when you're going to have to face the judgment of others as a parent. There are times when people are going to scoff and ridicule what you're doing. There are times when people are going to say, well, I don't think you should have, or when I was your age, or when our kids were your kids' age, we did. Put them out. Put them out. Put them out. And don't listen to them. Don't be afraid, just believe. When Jesus is on the scene, everything changes. And that's what happens for Jairus. We have to be brave enough to face the judgment of others. And finally, what these all boil down to is that Jairus had to be brave enough to face his fear. He had to be brave enough to step out in faith because his fear is what fueled that pride. His fear is what fueled that religiosity. His fear of the judgment of others is what fueled that, and that fear is what he had to overcome. That's why Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe. Just believe. Just hold on. Each step in this process required Jairus to step outside of his comfort zone. And each step required him to trust in Jesus more than he trusted in everything else that he knew. Parenting's hard. But this morning I want you to hear the words of Jesus. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Believe. Just believe that when Jesus is in your house, that Jesus is more powerful than whatever you are facing. Believe that Jesus will put out those who laugh at him. Believe that Jesus will ignore those that say you should leave him alone or that the one you love is dead or beyond hope. Believe that religion and sound doctrine is not what saves us. Jesus is. Believe that no matter who you are, a synagogue ruler or an unclean, rejected woman, Jesus has time for you. That woman is in this story because a woman with an issue of blood that Jesus touches. A few months before this, Jairus wouldn't even have allowed him in the synagogue, let alone in his home, if he had touched a woman with an issue of blood. But sometimes our need trumps our fear. And when that happens, we have to cling to those words. Don't be afraid, just believe. We're going to sing a song, and we're going to have people at the back of the room to pray with you. We have a prayer room over here. Or I encourage you to come down front. If you don't know Jesus, if you haven't allowed Him into your home, if you haven't invited Him in to be in your family, then today is the day to do that. I encourage you. We're going to sing this song, and I encourage you right now to come down and publicly confess His name, to repent of those sins that have kept you from Him in the past, to profess that belief before all these witnesses, and to be buried with Him in baptism, to be raised a new creature, totally in His power, in His control. If you haven't done that, now is the time. Whatever we can do to help you, I encourage you to come while we stand and sing.
I have been a wayward child. I have acted out. I have questioned sovereignty and had my share of doubts. And though some